Tell us why you're here today. Why are you here?
I'm here to celebrate my friend Maria and her wonderful book and her birthday.
Oh yes,
I'm looking forward to reading it.
I'm not very good on camera, so.
You ready? Yeah, for them.
They're selling like hotcakes.
There she is, the celebrity on Armenian television, Horizon. Maria Armoudian. Okay, Ani and Joe, we have entered the inner theater.
You want to ask coffee?
Okay,
What's your impression so far?
Where do the gifts go? I don't want to carry this thing all the way.
That's your only response? Okay,
Yeah.
bye.
And the question of the day, where is Maria?
Yes, where is Maria? Agavni inchpesas. Shatlav. We're here for a very important event.
We are.
Why are we here?
For Maria's book launching and birthday party.
And yeah, birthday party. And there's about 300 people here, it looks like. Do you know all of these people?
No, I've met several of them.
Does Maria?
She knows them. She knows every one of them.
And what do you want to say to Maria on this occasion?
I want to tell her this is a first step towards the rest of her life.
Yes. Hi.
Hello.
Lisa, why are we here today?
We are here to celebrate the fabulous launch of Maria's fabulous first book, and we're all very excited.
And also, is Maria nearby?
I think she might be. Oh my
Oh, look, here
goodness.
she is now.
I need to take my mother over here to meet
Maria, how are
my
you?
mentor.
Oh, okay, she's busy.
Ann Kriegler, this is my wearing. It's so funny to meet you. And this is my job.
She's proudly walking around, balancing a glass of wine.
Diet Coke.
Are you happy today?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm sure that I need.
Great, thank you very much, Will. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It is wonderful to have such a big crowd out here. As Will mentioned, my name is John Rigardi. I'm a board member of the Los Angeles Press Club, and I would not be a good board member if I did not repeat. Please consider joining the LA Press Club. Talk to Will, talk to Diana. We will get you hooked up. I'm also the executive editor of the Los Angeles Downtown News. But tonight, I have the very special privilege and honor of being here to speak with Maria Armoudian. Can we bring her up on stage, please? I did hear someone singing Happy Birthday, and she actually kind of dared me to not lead the crowd in Happy Birthday because it is her birthday on Tuesday. She has just turned 27.
26.
26.
Oh, sorry.
No, we will not make you suffer through that. Anyways, this is really a wonderful evening, a great book to be talking about tonight. I think, what Maria has done is she's taken something that a lot of journalists, a lot of people, in fact, will mind flash to. Gee, what's it like to be a reporter in a hot zone in Rwanda, in Northern Ireland, in Taiwan, and then, as many of the journalists in the LA Press Club know, you quickly mind flash onto another subject because you have no attention span or you have a deadline. Maria, on the other hand, was fortunate enough, or maybe had the impossible task of digging really deeply into about a dozen, shall we say, case studies, and exploring what it was like to be a reporter and the role of the media. And that's why we're here to talk about Kill the Messenger, the media's role in the fate of the world, a book release. So let's first give her a big hand for getting this book done. Now, you're all very familiar with her, of course. Before we get into all the questions, we know, obviously, your work on radio with KPFK and your writing, but just so people can know a little bit more about you, can you give us the 25-cent bio, where you're from, how you got into this field?
Oh boy, a 25-cent bio. How much time do I have? We ask in radio.
I hate talking about myself, but you know, I harangued my friend Terrence McNally for doing this on the air last week. But I think the more important part of me has to do with my heritage and my historic background. My grandparents were both genocide survivors on both sides. My mom and my dad's, each of their fathers survived the genocide, and both sides lost significant members of their family. And so I think I was automatically kind of tuned into, you know, why do these things happen, and why would they target my family, my historic family, who would have been my aunts and uncles and such. And I think that that's part of what led me down the path. My parents came to the United States as immigrants, and came here for their PhDs. But they, you know, were both, you know, for lack of a better word, refugees in their respective countries. My mother in Cyprus, my dad in Lebanon. I hope I'm not embarrassing my mom. She's here. She flew in. And they grew up in really extraordinarily difficult situations, as a lot of refugee types of kids do. And but they managed to make it through. Well, you know, my dad's story is kind of an interesting one. A lot of you had probably heard it if you listened to Terrence's show, but he, my grandfather made it as a tailor. He was 10 or 11 or 12, this is my dad's dad, when the Armenian genocide occurred. And so he didn't have an education and didn't really have a trade, but he did learn how to sew, and he became a very good tailor in Lebanon. And so when my father was in grade school, my grandfather thought the thing to do would be to take him out of school and teach him the trade. You know, why would anybody go get an education? What good is that going to do? And what happened is the principal of the middle school came to their house, you know, no phones, and said, you know, you really should leave him in school, and if you leave him in school, we'll pay for it, because he's really gifted in math and science. Well, that happened again. We was going to pull him out during middle school, and the high school principal came over and said, really, look, we'll pay for it, because we really think he's kind of gifted in math and science. And he ended up getting the Rockefeller Scholarship to go to the American University of Beirut. And so he became a physicist, came to the United States for his PhD, and met my mother at AUB. They showed me actually the spot where he proposed to her. It was kind of fun. But so I think that's the more interesting part about my background. I don't think my life is particularly interesting compared to that.
Fair enough. Plenty of questions about the book, but what I want to do is I want to start actually right on the cover and right at the top of these three words. The book is titled Kill the Messenger. Why did you pick that title? It certainly is kind of ominous sounding.
It's kind of ominous sounding. Well, it's supposed to have multiple meanings. So obviously I'm not talking about killing journalists. And obviously I'm not talking about killing the medium or the media, plural of medium itself, or themselves, because it's actually plural. But I'm talking about starting to kill the old paradigms of media and start to explore kind of a new paradigm. And this is for several reasons, like what we will get into. And one is that media have been used to further all kinds of political goals all over the world, and some of them are really awful. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those. But even in the United States, I see how media can be used in multiple ways, even when we as journalists don't want it to be used in that way, just by the way we are trained and the way we do our news gathering and the way news is defined. There are just constraints on what we can actually do for our audiences as a source of information and as a source of knowledge. And so, you know, the very tail end of the book, I talk about how this is the clincher. So,
are we giving away the ending?
Yeah. Should I not? But hang on, I got to get through all these footnotes because there's so many of them. So the very back page, I say, you know, knowing that so much more is possible, both for humanity and as a whole and for individuals, media can contribute to a better humanity. And my thinking is that everything we do makes an impact And if we can start to, so even when we're trying to be objective, like as journalists, we're trying to be objective and to try to be neutral, but in fact, we're still putting forth a particular kind of value system and a particular kind of a paradigm. And if we're aware of that, we can put forth the kind of paradigm and value system that we want and that we stand for, instead of what is kind of thrown way to be, or kind of an automatic way of being, as by virtue of the system that we have grown up in and been trained in.
So in the way that you arrange Kill the Messenger, you examine the media's role in a lot of global conflicts and hotspots, these sort of case studies from the Rwandan genocide to the Holocaust to Northern Ireland to Chile to Taiwan and beyond. We'll go deeper into a few of these in moments, but just to start, how did the idea and the desire to explore the media and its impact in this way come about?
It's Anne Kriegler's fault. She's back there. It's not really totally true. My mentor is here. She's the chair of my dissertation committee, and she's been a huge influence on me in terms of really looking at the complexities of political situations. Okay, first I want to make sure I answer your question. So ask me exactly how you...
Basically, how did the idea to explore the media and its impact?
So there is a debate within the scholarly community about whether or not media really have effects. And it's been kind of limited to, yes, they have effects, no, they don't have effects, and they have all these various, I won't go into all the details, all these various ways of examining that. Well, I couldn't quite buy the no effects argument, partly because of what I did know about history and about some of these political situations. And so I wanted to look and see, first by scouring the peer-reviewed literature, how they might have effects, when they might have effects, and how that actually comes about. In the end, I settled in on what we call a constructionist model, which means that media are one of many factors that impact the final outcome, which isn't ever final because politics are always fluid and they're always changing, and as more circumstances come in and intertwine with each other. But the idea is that political situations happen largely because of how people view the world and events and occurrences, what they believe to be occurring, how they interpret things that are happening, and people that are involved in them. And one of the key ways in which they understand the political outcomes is via the media messages and how they are framed. So there's a famous quote by a scholar who says, "Facts don't frame themselves." So you've got this massive amount of information that is coming, especially to a journalist, and you go, well, how do I sort all this out? And you end up putting it into a narrative or a frame. And it doesn't affect everybody in the same way, but that is one of the key factors that have people decide what they really think is so. And then collections of people act based on that. Is this too esoteric?
Right.
Does this make sense?
Well, we got a smart crowd here. Marie, we spoke the other day, and you talked about one of the premises of this book being how the media's role in some of these countries, in most of these countries, depends on who's in charge. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between what you referred to, I thought it was a great term, the bad actors and the real ethical journalists?
Right. So this is part of the big key of what I'm talking about. So part of what I was trying to demonstrate here was when bad actors do control the means of communication, that their motives will inform what comes out the other end, and you end up sometimes in the worst case scenarios with things like the Rwandan genocide, the Holocaust, the Bosnian War, and many of the others that ended up turning around, like Burundi. We talked about that on the phone a bit. When journalists actually get to do their jobs and do them well, and when they are actually giving to their audiences a really thorough understanding of what is occurring, and giving them the frameworks to help them understand, like in a case of a war, understand why the war is occurring, for example, it really helps to dispel the rumors that do tend to come up when bad actors have it, and help to bring about more positive results.
Well, and you referenced something that that is the natural follow-up for that. Obviously, particularly interesting elements of this book is your exploration of the Rwandan genocide, and particularly the relationship of Rwanda and Burundi. These are two African countries that are right next to each other, are very similar in demographics and makeup, yet in these countries the media had a decidedly different role during the time of crisis. At the risk of asking you to boil down a crazily complex issue into saying what the differences are, can you boil it down and say what the differences are and what you found?
Well, I like to think, first of all, as the Rwandan situation is almost like what we call a natural experiment, where before the RTLM, which was a privately held radio station, it was a very hip radio station. Everybody listened to it. It had the best music on. It had the best jokes on. It was just fun, and everybody woke up. And the other point is also it was the main source of media, because in Rwanda there's a low literacy level, and television wasn't really present. So before the RTLM came in and started changing their frames, and I'll get into that, the two primary ethnic groups in Rwanda, there had been some fighting occasionally. It wasn't really anything extreme. People were intermarried. They went to school together. They went to church together. They were essentially a community, and religion was the same, language was the same, no substantive difference. The RTLM started changing how they talked about one of the ethnic groups, the Tutsis. They started to blame them for all the socioeconomic problems in Rwanda. It was already in pretty serious poverty, and so there were problems. And they started warning the Hutu, the other ethnic group, which was in the majority, that these Tutsis were going to destroy their homeland. And you know what? The Tutsis didn't belong to Rwanda anyway. They weren't the natives. They were invaders. They were dirty. They were ruining Rwanda. And on top of that, they were going to come kill you if you don't kill them first.
And cockroaches.
So you saw in 100 days, 800,000 Tutsis killed. Now, the most remarkable thing about this...
800,000?
Yeah.
Wow.
In 100 days, which meant they had to get regular people to participate in the killing. And it ended up being so awful, where teachers were killing their students, and doctors were killing their patients, and brother, in some cases, killed brother. I opened the chapter with a brother who was faced with, from his own ethnic group, he had to either kill his brother or he was going to get killed, because his brother was married to a Tutsi and had helped the Tutsi. So it was just that awful. And they ran to the churches, and they got slaughtered in the churches. And
this was all propelled by the radio station? Or
it was several things. Remember, I'm a constructionist. So the radio station was helping to convince people that they had to do this. But at the same time, you had the government organizing community to community. So, but how impossible would it be to get you to kill your neighbor? I mean, it would take a lot of convincing that your neighbor is really evil. And this is one of the things that media scholars have looked at, and one of the quotes that I think I used in the book, if I could say it properly, is, this is how you turn your neighbor into a monster. You're turning the man you know into a monster. Okay, can I contrast this with Burundi? Okay, so the reason Rwanda next to Burundi are the most, I think, important chapters is that Burundi used to be part of Rwanda. Same two ethnic groups. Kind of the same, occasionally it would break out into some violence, and there were certain extremists that were killing each other already. There was no RTLM, so it never escalated into genocide. But what was more important is something more profound happened. And that is that a lot of NGOs came in. One of them is in Washington called the Search for Common Ground. And they funded a new media that would be neutral, factual, and when rumors were raised and gossip was raised, they would dispel it. The way they had the journalists go report news is that one person of each ethnicity had to go together to get each piece of news, and they had to agree on it before they could report it. So then you knew that it wasn't going to be inflammatory on one side or the other. By the way, they did a little bit of this in Northern Ireland too, whenever they were during the peace process. The other thing that these journalists did is that they didn't follow the public officials' framing. So when the public officials said, you know, this group is X, you know, and I can't remember all the details of it, you know, they challenged it and they went out and they looked and they went and explored it and they didn't take it for fact. And they found that often public officials were shaping things in a way that would benefit their side at the detriment of the other side, and so they didn't report it and they confronted them. And then there are two other factors. One is also journalism and one is actually fiction. The other piece of journalism was they did public forums and radio call-in shows where they had experts to help people understand all these dynamics that were going on, and including things like group psychology and why people behaved the way they did. And then they had people call in and talk about their own experiences. So they had this mix of scholars or you know, historians, and then they had regular people call in. And one of the things that happened, and I think you and I talked about this there too, is that while the war was going on, people completely separated so that the Hutu were enemy from the Tutsi, and the Tutsi were enemy from the Hutu. But and so if you tried to help somebody who was a Tutsi, and you were a Hutu, I'm sorry. Let me see if I just lost. I told you, deer in headlights. I have deer in headlights moments. So if I was a Tutsi and I helped a Hutu, my own people would target me as a traitor and kill me, or something awful. So people couldn't tell the truth if they were actually saving people, and so this entire cultural phenomenon was happening, where it was unsafe. Through this radio programming, they actually had a show called Heroes. People started calling in and saying, well, you know, I did help. I did rescue somebody from the other side. And eventually the meaning changed so that if I was a Tutsi and I helped a Hutu, I became known as a hero. The entire meaning changed, and this is part of what happens in framing. And the final piece, well, it wasn't really the final, but the final piece that I'll talk about, because I know we're running out of time, is through fiction, they created this radio soap opera where they actually used the issues of the day, but they never told people who was in the characters, who was a Hutu and who was a Tutsi. And so they were struggling with all these issues that were prevalent in the place, and you developed sympathy for the character, but you never knew which ethnicity it was. And they always did the right thing, of course, because that's how soap operas are. Of course.
You referenced something that I definitely want to jump into, particularly with us being Los Angeles Press Club here, Northern Ireland, and I know that there were, you know, ways that some of the reporters made. There were strictures against what they could do, who they could even talk to. Just tell us a little bit about what went on there in a conflict that's been going on for what, decades?
Yeah, it went on for I think I could be completely wrong in this, but I think it was the longest standing conflict in Europe. Yeah, what an interesting situation that was. So first of all, historical context. Most people probably know this, but just in case you don't. The Northern Ireland conflict was rooted in Great Britain back in the colonial days, settling in Ireland. And the South, the 26 counties, managed to fight the British and win their 26 counties and win their independence, calling themselves the Republic of Ireland. But they negotiated away the 6 counties in the north. And they did that in part because it was mostly dominated by Brits and Scots, and it was part of the settlement agreement. Well, there were still a significant number of native Irish who were mostly Catholic. Religion doesn't play as much of a role here as people think it did. It was really more, should we be, it was what they call the constitutional issue. Should we be part of the Republic of Ireland, or should we be part of Great Britain? And the native Irish, who were Catholic, were part of the minority. They were treated very badly. They were largely unemployed. They didn't have good housing. And the people in power, who were of British and Scottish descent, thought they were troublemakers and really discriminated against them in almost every way. So the Native Irish, there were several things going on. There was kind of a violent movement, which was the IRA, and it took several different forms. But then there was a civil rights movement that emerged that was kind of modeled after the US civil rights movement. And then as they started to do these peaceful protests, we had a big, gigantic protest, which most people know was Bloody Sunday, where there were a lot of people that were shot, but 13 people, as they were fleeing the British Army, were shot dead. Well, so several things were going on in the media. First of all, the international media covered that, and so did the Catholic media, for lack of a better term, because there were a lot of people that were not of either religion, but were affiliated with the other. So there's kind of a little bit of a, I would say, somewhat diverse media locally, polarized because everybody kind of had their own. So the Irish Republican movement, the IRA and the Sinn Féin had their own media, the more Protestants had their own media, and so there was this kind of media war going on throughout this period. I'm going to try to fast forward this. I just felt like I just needed to give a little context. But most of the mainstream media just saw the Republican movement and the Native Irish civil rights movement more or less as troublemakers, and just wanted to, quiet them down and not hear them, especially the Republicans, the IRA, and so they just called them terrorists and said, we don't talk to terrorists. And we need to restrict their ability to talk to us, to talk to people and be in the media. And so they had a soft ban, just kind of pressure on journalists. You can't cover the IRA. You can't put them on TV. Well, these guys were really smart. The Sinn Féin, which are the kind of political arm of the IRA, they ran a guy for parliament from prison. And he won. And so it became huge news all over the world. And they had these demands that they made on the British government, and the British government said no way, and so he went on a hunger strike along with several other people in prison that were in the movement. Well, the British government said, sorry, we don't talk to terrorists, we don't give in to terrorists. He died. And so did the other hunger strikers. Well, that created a huge media storm. Well, then there was the response. The British government said, all right then, no terrorists on the air. Broadcasting ban. You cannot air the voices of anybody who's in a terrorist group. That included the IRA, and it included people in the other paramilitary that was called the Loyalist paramilitaries. Journalists still were trying to understand all of the conflict. Not all of them. There's always, you always see these kind of leaders in each professional field. Well, so one of the things they did, the way they defied the broadcasting ban, I love telling journalists this, is they read the letter of the law and they said, oh, we can't air the voices of journalists. So, okay, they air the face of a journalist, of one of the Sinn Féin leaders, like Jerry Adams, of him talking. And then they get an actor to lip sync. And I actually met the guy who was the voice of Martin McGuinness while I was up there. He was the editor of the Dairy Journal. So that's one way. But then they also risked their lives to go and talk to terrorists, who later became, by the way, they're running the government in part now. They've got a shared agreement. They are elected officials, government officials, these so-called terrorists. And no doubt there was a lot of violence going on, a lot of fighting, a lot of wars. Journalists have not forgotten, who killed who, but they've also allowed people to become something different from who they were. And I think that's a really important thing, that we don't throw people into, you're always a killer during the war. But one of the ways that they went and got the information, of course, you couldn't know who was in the IRA. So they would show up at a location, they'd be blindfolded, put into a car, driven to some undisclosed location, given the statements from the IRA, driven back, and dropped off, and they could never see these people because they had masks on. So they really, and I think in the entire Northern Ireland conflict, only one journalist was killed. So that's one of, there are a lot of journalists that have been killed in other conflicts, like Bosnia. It's a major war on journalists there. But so, you know, so this is one of the major ways I feel like journalists have made a difference. And then a couple of just other things, which is when the peace agreement was being negotiated, you know, I think we are largely trained as journalists to look for the disagreements and to look for the conflict, but they also really looked for where there was agreement, and they reported on, and one scholar calls them peace frames, talking about where there's consensus rather than always where there's fighting or where there's conflict. And that also enabled, in putting these concepts out there, there's a lot of really deep reporting going on.
I want to jump continents a little bit. There's other things I just find.
I think I hit almost every continent.
I think
Almost.
Almost. We got one more.
Oh. No, I meant in the book.
Oh, I think you did. You have a pretty interesting situation in your coverage of Chile. Can you talk a little bit about how a nation was a very peaceful, nice place for a long time, how a newspaper in that country wound up entangled with the sweet, lovely Central Intelligence Agency?
Chile is a remarkable story because of two sides. One is media were involved in the downfall of the democracy, and then media, the journalists, were very involved in rebuilding democracy in Chile. So what John's referring to is so first of all, when Salvador Allende was elected, he wanted to nationalize the newsprint. And that upset a very powerful media mogul, no names mentioned, but his initials are Augustin Edwards. And he was very friendly with a lot of important, powerful people, and made his way to meet with President Nixon, and along with a few of his other friends, helped to convince Nixon that he needed to get involved in Chile and get rid of Allende. And so there were several stages in this, and I'll just kind of glum it into one so you don't have to listen to me talk for too long. But so the CIA put his newspaper on the payroll, and they started to put out very awful propaganda, not just about Allende, although they would do some awful things about Allende, calling him, you know, everything from just a drunkard to, you know, some of the things we're actually hearing people call Obama these days, I think. But they also would juxtapose his picture next to like slaughtered animals, and they would blame Allende and all of the leftists, there were several different leftist groups, for terrorist acts that were actually being paid for by the CIA. And so people were not getting accurate information, and it was fomenting this disagreement, also this fighting between two groups of people. It's more than two, I'm simplifying it, that used to really get along well. I mean, Chile, A, it was the longest standing democracy in South America. B, it was this culture where, I think I heard Mark Cooper once say, or I think he wrote it in one of his books, people always addressed each other as madame and sir. It was just like very kind of, you know, generous and respectful. Now, you couldn't run into somebody in the street without like screaming at each other, and they were polarized and they hated each other. And people were saying, we're happy that the coup happened. And then, of course, all the human rights abuses were occurring, people were tortured, but people didn't know about it because all the other media were shut down through the military dictatorship. But then the good side of the story is the journalists again, some of them fled. A lot of them had to flee, go into exile because they were under threat also, and some of them were killed. But they kept broadcasting through shortwave radio back into Chile so that people could hear what they were getting through international media and through their sources. But then there were people within Chile that would have these orders by the government, and they would disobey them in various ways. They'd get this statement they were supposed to read, and they would read it with sort of tongue-in-cheek humor, like, oh, and the price of peanuts in Mexico today is, to sort of make fun of the statement, so people would understand that this is really BS and we're being forced to read this. There were a lot of different leaks that occurred. They would just slip into the media so that people could start to hear other realities other than what the Pinochet dictatorship was putting out. And gradually, I mean, I don't think Chile has ever been rebuilt to the level of pluralism that it had before or the degree of democracy that it had before, but at least it's back on track as a democracy, and largely it's because of these journalists that kept pushing the envelope a little bit more and more. They kept getting shut down. One other piece to this is this is a place where the Catholic Church played an enormously positive role. And while human rights abuses were going on, the Catholic Church maintained a media of its own. And they were the only ones, a lot of the time, that the government wasn't shutting down. And in fact, one bishop confronted Pinochet at a certain point. He said, you know, you can't stop the vicariate because I will put every human rights victim under my bed if I have to. And it was that kind of standing up to the abuses that were happening that finally started to open it up and expose it. I won't go into the Pope, but the Pope played a hugely important role because in Chile, a Catholic country, the media can't ignore the Pope showing up. And he embraced the people whose children were killed or disappeared, and he asked them questions, and the media couldn't really turn them away. And you just saw this kind of move together to finally bring about the end of an era. I have to say that the international media played a gigantic role too. I spent some time talking to a guy named John Dingus. Does anybody here know him? You know John? Amazing guy. He lived in Chile. He reported for like the Washington Post and other places. He started an investigative agency down there. He was married to a Chilean woman. But so a lot of this was also coming from international pressure. So the internal journalists were the people who were like journalists for American newspapers were sending it out, and the international pressure was coming back after Nixon, of course, obviously. But when you had subsequent presidents, Carter, for example. Is that too long-winded?
No, it's good.
You sure?
It's a just incredibly fascinating subject.
There are a lot of, These stories are just remarkable when you really get into them.
Yeah, and don't worry, I'm not going to make you keep going through all of them. That's why everyone is buying the book, so they can read all of them. One of the things that I do want to ask you, these stories, these case studies certainly just make us think about the people who are involved, about the current media. And I think obviously there's many horrifying instances that you described, but in these situations where the media was used to incite violence, to incite hatred, this terrible framing, did it tend to be a case of the reporters buying into what those in power were selling? Were they scared and threatened into it? Were they just spun and very effectively manipulated by CIAs or other equivalent organizations, or were we finding all three?
I think all three. And in some cases it's just pure pressure. I think we are all subject to a very strong peer pressure, and a friend of mine once called it careerism. Kind of everybody wants to succeed, and so there are certain ways in which you can be liked and be appreciated and be approved of. And part of that is the structure in which we work as journalists. And so each of these had those kinds of structures, and some were more extreme than others. In other cases, it was the dominant frame. They may have really believed that they were right or their government was right. And I think you have to take each one of these very separately. Just one little thing about this kind of peer pressure thing. There is a body of work that looks at social laws, and the idea that social laws are actually more powerful than real state laws. So the example I think that kind of says it best is like Steve would never wear a pink suit because you'd be ridiculed. And so we obey social laws far more readily than we obey state laws. You just can't break those. And so and in each institution and in each culture, there are these social laws that develop. And if you don't obey them, you become it's like social death.
You spend so much time describing these important and sometimes heroic roles that a journalist in these countries are playing. Do you think that people in this country, the reporters here, realize how powerful a position we have? What a, in some cases, monumental responsibility we have?
I think yes and no. Actually, I think it's more no than yes. I don't think we realize how much communication impacts people. And I also don't think it's an individual article usually that makes the difference, or an individual broadcast, as much as it's kind of this accumulation of a dominant way of seeing things, or a dominant framework that becomes impossible to dispel even when it's a lie. Just an American example that I saw, actually I think, I'm trying to remember where I saw this, was like Al Gore being called a serial exaggerator. And you couldn't dispel that he was a liar, but in fact he was not lying about the things that he had done in the past. But no matter how much he tried to argue and show people, look, here's the facts, this is what I actually did, people thought he was lying. And it was just this kind of paradigm that you couldn't dispel.
Another thing that ties into to where we are today, and I mean, obviously, as everyone knows, so much information is no longer delivered in the way it was by the traditional journalists, whether print or your evening news, but by bloggers, but by the citizen journalists, by Twitter or whatever other social media forms there are and that will be next that we haven't thought of yet. How does this fit into the equation of what we're talking about now and into the future?
Well, first of all, it's making it messier. But at the same time, one of the things that you're seeing is a repeat of the same thing over and over again in all the blogs, or all the blogs on the left, or all the blogs on the right, or all the ones in a particular leaning. And a lot of times they're getting the original reporting from the traditional news source. So there are a couple things. One is there's a lot more rumor out there that is not verified, and that's getting spread around like fact. That is dangerous. That is how the killing occurred in Rwanda or in Burundi, is that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, obviously we don't have people saying, go out and, kill John, but you don't hear that except for in the extremist media, which, by the way, I should add that. The Anders Breivik case that just occurred, he got all that material about again, the Norway massacres. Again, how these groups of people were ruining society, and he really believed he had to go kill these people. The example I used in my book, which obviously I wrote this before him, was this man, in Knoxville, Tennessee, who had been listening to Michael Savage and all of these people who said liberals were evil and they were destroying the United States, and they had to be destroyed, and they were parasites. So he picks up a shotgun, puts it in a guitar case, shows up at the Knoxville, Tennessee church, Universalist Unitarian Church, where the kids are putting on a play, Annie Jr. So he goes in, everybody thinks he's a musician because he's carrying the guitar case, and he pulls out a shotgun and he opens fire. And he kills a bunch of people in the church. And he believed he was doing the right thing, because he thought he was saving America. So, was that your question? No, you were asking about new media. Okay, so, but I tied that in there because, so there's...
It's okay, go with it. It certainly applies to everything that we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think there's several things going on with new media. One is that it's faster, it's messier, it's harder to parse out what is reality. We don't have the traditional gatekeepers we used to have, which is good and which is bad. Traditional gatekeepers kept out a lot of information that we might have wanted to hear and perspectives. At the same time, it also kept out a lot of the rumor mill and the things that are destroying people's livelihoods in some cases. And so traditional journalists were always trained to get two sources and to verify it with at least what they reported with two sources. Well, that's pretty much gone, and it's pretty much gone not across traditional media, but certainly in the blogosphere. But even traditional media now has to work so fast. Everything is so much faster. They have to get it out all the time. It's a 24-hour cycle, and it's becoming harder and harder to be. You should be able to talk to this.
Yeah, no. It is endemic. I mean, you are in a crunch to get things out. And so certain publications and certain websites have standards, and other ones realize that if you get that story up quickest, you will get 3,000 hits in the space of a couple hours, and if you're ninth, you don't.
Right.
But what you referenced there, is the danger of this. How do people? Is there a way to guard against this based on what you've seen, based on your research?
I really feel strongly that journalists need to form an organization that will do several things. One is that it will establish a way or several ways in which they can take their profession back from other people who might have other goals that are not about informing and educating. So doctors have organization that overlooks them. They have the
AMA.
Thank you, the board. And lawyers have their bar. And so it's like professions that can do damage to individuals have a body, a professional body that oversees what they do. And journalism has a kind of this very widespread kind of impact on people's lives. And again, of course, it intermingles with all these other factors. But so they need a body that will help them to keep the ethics high and to self-police their own that are not doing that. Number two, that can keep the other factors that influence them out. Now, some newspapers are unionized, but the unions often don't protect the journalist's right to be ethical. They protect the journalist's income. I think there's a problem here. And then finally, I think that every profession has to keep shining a mirror on itself and going, how can we improve this? How can we what are our constraints? What are our cultural constraints? What are our reward system constraints? What are the weaknesses in the system? And I think through an organization like this, if journalists would come together, that would work. The final thing that I've been thinking about is the corporate structure. When it's for-profit only, it doesn't work, obviously. When it's for-profit and it has a mission, it can work. I think the New York Times is a really good newspaper.
Well, let me just jump in here, because I think this does kind of relate to a question, to something that we did talk about. And I mean, these days, particularly with the publications and with the broadcasters, I mean, we increasingly see media outlets that that are owned not by themselves, but by these large parent corporations, some of which respond to shareholders, others of which respond to a political leaning or a fair and balanced agenda. Did I say that? Sorry. Are there models?
Talk about KPFK?
No. Was that the Murdoch station? Are there models?
You mock me.
No, I think I mock. Are there models out there that that resist this, and that people in the audience, the journalists in the field, can learn from and can be inspired by and be part of themselves?
Boy, am I glad you asked that question.
That's why I wanted to jump in.
Okay, so the corporate model, of course, has to have a profit. And it can become a constraint on journalism, because then you have to compete with all these other models. There are a whole bunch of other models that are being experimented with. Now in Mexico, I have a chapter on Mexico. Most of the media were kind of patrons of the government. So whatever the PRI said, the PRI was the power, it was the perfect dictatorship, as scholars like to say. Whatever the PRI told them to report, they reported, except for a couple small newspapers that were co-ops. These were newspapers owned and operated and decided on by the journalists. They only had to respond to each other. And it empowered them to be able to make these kinds of decisions that were within the realm of what it was they were about. We were about journalism. The other model, one of the other models I talk about is the trust model, and the example of that is The Guardian of London. And a trust is a kind of structure where you are in existence in order to further a particular mission. And The Guardian is journalism. Their mission is journalism. It's also liberal values, but it's journalism. And so it enables them to always be true first and foremost to that, that goal. The other model that has not been explored very much, and I think it should be, is an institutional model that is tied to an institution like a university. Now, Wisconsin did this with Wisconsin Public Radio for a while, where the radio was kind of like a classroom in a way. They had all kinds of information, public affairs information, but it's something that needs to be explored far more. Another idea that I keep thinking would be great, and I don't know how to construct it, and if anybody here is at a university besides political scientists, help me on this, and that would be an inter-university media, because there's so much knowledge within the universities that is not getting out to the public. And to enable people to access that gigantic body of knowledge would be just really, really something. So these are just some of the things I've been talking about and thinking about. How do you, the orientation of an organization always influences its outcome. What its ultimate goal is always influences where it goes. And so you have to look at what that is. There's also obviously the nonprofit model, a little bit constrained because you have to have donors, but you can do it. KPFK is one, which thank you, KPFK. And by the way, if anybody's not a member, I hope you join tonight. The LA Press Club is a nonprofit. The other, with the internet, there's also this kind of open source model where a lot of people can contribute. The Wikipedia, for example. Problem with that, of course, is anybody can contribute, and you might end up with some inaccuracies. It may take some time to take it down. I see you pulling your microphone up. I'll shut up.
I was just going to ask Diana, do we have time to take a few questions from them? Okay, we got time for a couple questions. Can you just, when you stand up, can you just please say your name so we know who we're talking to? And I'm going to start with that nice gentleman right there.
Wait a minute, he's my boss.
Oh, is this Alan?
Actually, I'm representing someone else. So a kind gentleman dropped by but had to leave. And he handed this to me. It's from the city of Los Angeles, state of California, and it says congratulations and on the celebration of two tremendous milestones, your birthday and the release of your first book, Kill the Messenger, the media's role in the fate of the world. Your tremendous talents as a radio host, journalist, and as a political scientist has informed your valuable insight and helped our collective global understanding. May your career continue to flourish, and I wish you the best of luck in all your future endeavors. Paul Krikorian, Council Member.
I just want you guys to know that I have served in the city of Los Angeles as a volunteer commissioner on the environment for 5 years, and I'm now getting appointed to another commission, and I've never gotten acknowledged. One other thing, I worked in the state legislature for 8 years and never got acknowledged. So thank you.
Happy birthday.
Can you say your name, please?
Dan Abrams. What do you feel about PolitiFact and those sorts of sites, and should there be a PolitiFact for sources, not just for politicians?
Yeah, there are actually a whole bunch of these kinds of things that are emerging. They're very good. There's factcheck.org too. Notes. Yeah, I absolutely think these are vital. Thank God people are doing this. It's actually helping people quite a bit to untangle information. There's also some great sites like the Center Excellence in Journalism. Help me here. The Pew Center for Excellence in Journalism. You know, Columbia Journalism Review helps you untangle these things. Yeah, I think these are vital kinds of organizations. I actually haven't looked at that particular one, PolitiFacts, but I'm assuming it's like Fact Check.
Okay, gentleman right there at the top.
Steve Rohde.
Hi, Steve Rohde.
So, a few days after 9/11, Dan Rather went on David Letterman and said, "Mr. President, reporting for service." He saw his job in the press as reporting for service in that context. How did you resist covering the corrupt American media in the run-up to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, there's a few things. One is there was a lot out there already. One of the things I really wanted to do, Steve Rohde, and your old partner is over here somewhere, my agent, Paul Levine, thank you. He got me this book deal. One of the things I really wanted to do, Steve Rohde, was take the focus off of the United States. Because sometimes it's really hard to communicate to your own when you're looking right at somebody. And so I thought perhaps if I showed all these other examples that were extreme, so you could see kind of the extremes, that maybe I could communicate more with the American audiences who are very polarized today. You know, if I came right out and did the Dan Rather thing, I guarantee I would have lost 2/3 of people that might have listened to how the framing of situations and how the, you know, lack of responsibility in mass media were having a very detrimental impact on the world. So part of it was strategic and wanting to communicate with more Americans. I thought this might make it a little bit easier to understand when you look at somebody else. It's sort of like when you watch a story about somebody else and you can relate to the person, as opposed to somebody telling you that you've got dirt on your face. That's part of the motivation. I didn't really want to confess it, but he made me.
Right in front.
Hi, I'm Deborah. I just have a question about, I live in London and been in Europe for 37 years, and if you look at the media of what you're exposed to, it's so much different than what you're exposed to in America. And so when I come back, my question to you as a person who has traveled, is it because that the journalists, what I said is I live in London, I've been in Europe 37 years, and the media is much different in Europe as it is in America. And is it because of your news or the information that's given to Americans, is it that it hasn't been given to Americans, so they're not allowed to have the knowledge or is it because because the media believes that the Americans cannot understand, or is it because they just haven't been given it? And if they had been given the information and the knowledge.
I think all of the above. Yeah, so what she's asking is, why are European media so different from American media? There's several things. One is they have publicly owned media, so BBC, for example, and a lot of the European countries have that structure. So it comes into play, and it's paid for by public dollars, and we don't have that here. Little bit of money goes to NPR, tiny fraction comes to Pacifica, little bit goes to the PBS stations, but it's not really supported. Now, I think public media is important, but I don't think it's the cure-all. There were journalists at the BBC that defied the broadcasting ban, but just the fact that the government could say there's a broadcasting ban is not good. So being under the thumb of government, in a democratic setting, it's better. But it was state-owned media in Nazi Germany. It was state-owned media in Bosnia. So then you're kind of at the behest of whoever's in power. And if you don't like the politics of the government, okay, I digress. I apologize. But I do think that a public media is very important, and that's part of why they have that. I also do think that when you are within a media system that is rich, that you demand more richness from your media. And, you know, we've had some richness in our media, but it's mostly in the print side. And so if people are not reading and they're only tuning into broadcast, it's you know, if they're just watching television, it's very hard to get acclimated to that kind of richness and depth. It's a lot of knowledge that comes. It just as a, you know, when I had to go and live in Northern Ireland to do some of this reporting, to do some of this research, and I rented a room from this guy over the internet, and he picked me up in the train station, and he was a construction worker, no education, and he knew more about American politics than most Americans do.
Yes.
And then it gets worse. His 10-year-old knew more about American history than some college graduates, and I was just thinking to myself,
very much.
I was quite taken by this, and I don't know if it was across the board because you don't talk to everybody, but you know, this was a guy who hadn't gone to college, but he really understood political concepts. Not that, like I said, it's, you know, this is just one anecdote. It's not necessarily meaningful, but I do think that that's something we have to think about.
I think we're just going to take a couple more because I believe you're going to do some book signing later, and if we take too many, then you will be here till 11 o'clock at night. And if that's the man who got you the book deal, he gets to ask the question.
Oh, no!
What are you working on next?
This is Paul Levine. He's my literary agent. So all of you have fabulous book ideas. He's over there in the blue shirt. You know, Paul, what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about looking at mental illness and how it has shaped the world. So this one was like media's role in the fate of the world. I'm thinking about looking at mental illness and its role in the world. And how I broke this up like the really bad cases and the really good cases. Well, you know, I think there's some of that here too. You got the really bad cases where you have like people like Hitler and Stalin. And then you have the really good cases where you had like, you know, Abraham Lincoln and Eleanor Roosevelt. And is Richard Dickmajian still here? I don't see him. Professor Richard Dickmajian? He must have slipped out. He didn't want to hear me talk. He's on my dissertation committee, so I'm glad he came. But he and I have been talking about this quite a bit because he does political psychology of leadership and the impact of that and how it interacts with us. So that's what I'm thinking about. What do you think? Do you think that's a good sellable idea? Will you give me a second book deal on it? Do we have to go with Prometheus again? Oh, did I say that? I love my publisher. Except, no.
The gentleman in the hat standing against the wall there.
Yeah, there was something mentioned about if Steve wore a pink suit. I hope we're living in a world where Steve can wear a pink suit and we'll all be okay with it.
It's called Miami. It's called 19.
You know, Steve, would you wear a pink suit?
Sure.
Are you lying?
Yeah, I'd wear a pink suit.
All right.
Start with a polo shirt.
Gentleman right there in the middle.
Well, I'm Neil Sampson. Well, for the record, I do have a pink shirt, though I'm not wearing
I said pink suit.
Yeah, I know.
I'm entirely pink.
But talking about shooting the messengers, what about the vitriol heaped on, was it whichever rating agency that downgraded the United States? Isn't that shooting the messenger too?
Well, I'm not an economist. I'm not even a political economist. I am a political scientist. You know, I've read probably what you've read in terms of the ratings agency, and I think that I'm on the fence about it. So I don't really, it's not something I can probably intelligently respond to. I have this policy of not speaking out of school. Like, you know, if I'm superficial on something, I probably shouldn't be talking
If
about
only
it.
everyone else followed that. Let's see, and let's go in the back, the gentleman there, because we haven't got, yeah, you.
Hey, we need some women here. Women questions.
There's one.
I spent a little bit of time in the Middle East, and I was sort of surprised to realize that even the Bedouins have satellite dishes, and you know, they're getting a lot of media out there, and I'm wondering what. I came in late, so I don't know whether you cover any examples in your book from Asia or the Middle East, but how you see the media in those areas influencing their people and possibly contributing to the spring that we see in the Middle East, and possibly something in China as well.
I touch on the Arab uprisings, but I didn't cover them at length because they happened after I finished the book, and I just had the chance to include a little bit about them. In terms of Asia, I covered Taiwan, because Taiwan, not a lot of people know about Taiwan, but it was under an authoritarian regime for a very long time, the KMT, and those journalists went to jail, and they were, they were tortured, and they went through all kinds of things to get a free press, and then to eventually be able to have an election where somebody else could get elected. Similar in some ways to Mexico, and happened about the same time. In terms of the Middle East, I think two things have been happening simultaneously there, three things perhaps. One is the internet, of course, and the other is Al Jazeera. And I think Al Jazeera has been an extraordinarily powerful force out there. That's great. Now, Al Jazeera has some problems, just like everything does. Now, they're mostly BBC-trained journalists. But it's owned and operated by Qatar, the country, Qatar. And so they're allowed to report on anything but Qatar. This is the issue. And so these are the things we have to stop and think about. In terms of the Arab uprising, most of us know about the Twitter and the Facebook that helped in Tunisia and then in Egypt, and the role of the Facebook executives and also the role of the Google executives in helping people to navigate their governments, because the government, and especially like in Tunisia, tried to intercept all the Facebook messages, and Facebook executives went in and moved them around so that they couldn't do that. But there's been far less attention paid to the role of Al Jazeera in that, and also the role of, after Tunisia happened, how do you think all that information got out to everybody else to lead to the others? Well, part of it was the internet, and the rest of it was traditional media. It's also, by the way, old-fashioned flyering. People passing out flyers. So there are all these kind of things going on together at the same time. We're fascinated by the new media, which I think we should be, because this is really important. People being able to, if my friend Rob Davidian is getting beaten by the government, for me to be able to, catch that on my cell phone and upload it right away. It's immediate, it's fast, and then you've got the cable companies like Al Jazeera aggregating all this stuff and then putting it out there even farther. The other role that the internet played is access to information and concepts like human rights and democracy that they weren't really able to get access to nearly as readily. Like there's this Professor Gene Sharp who had written this book about how to organize peaceful protest and knock out your dictatorship. This was like a guidebook for a lot of these people. They managed to get this information and find it, through these other alternative channels. So it's kind of this marriage between traditional and new media and old-fashioned flyering.
We're going to take, there was a woman right there in black who had her hands up. We're going to make this the last one. Yeah, that's you.
Good, because I have to go to the bathroom really, really bad.
What's your name?
My name is Gabby Cannon. And
I don't think you should let her ask a question. She's too cute.
I have more of a speculative question.
If you ask me something hard, I'm firing you.
So basically, you've touched on how in new media there's a lot of polarized journalism. There's
and in regular media.
Right, and with Wikipedia and all these other news sources that aren't verifiable and are just out there, and they're communicating what they present as facts, which might not be facts. And so I guess kind of in that context, I think that people are becoming inundated with information and are therefore, they're not engaging anymore. And so my question is we know that there's a danger of the wrong kind of journalism propelling people to do bad things. Is there also a danger of too much media, I guess, making people become apathetic? And how can someone who's an ethical journalist combat against apathy rather than something that's negative? So basically, how can ethical journalists maintain, their control of the fate of the world?
I don't think any single journalist can do it alone. I really think journalists have to pull together. and form organizations so that they have a little bit more power. Not only in the power of communicating with their audiences, but I think they need to pull together so that they have power against the other forces that constrain their abilities, whether they're financial or governmental or whatever, and they have to support each other in these ways. If once established, like in Burundi, this is one of my favorite examples. I know it's the last question. In Burundi, the journalists were targeted by the government. A few of them were killed. They would protect each other as much as they could. They only had like an hour a day that they got to do their broadcasting at first, where the government radio station let them have an hour a day for their reporting. But people started trusting them. They would meet the journalists, they would realize they, were not rumor mongering like the other sides were, and it gradually became the source that people went to. And by the way, just one other thing. One of the gentlemen that went down to organize this, an American guy, he, as he was leaving, he'd been there for 3-4 years, the head of the military sent him a note that said, because of your work, countless civilian lives have been saved. And for that, I thank you. Now, this came from a guy who had targeted him for most of the time he was there for death. Pretty profound change, even in the head of the military.
Well, this has
Great
been
place to end, isn't it?
I would just say that this has been a wonderful 70 or 80 minutes, or however long we've gone on now. Thank you so much for taking the time. Books you will be signing?
Yeah, after I go to the bathroom.
She will be signing. You can buy the book back there. You can join the press club back there. And can we please?
Can I just really thank the press club? This is so awesome. And thank you guys for coming. Can I tell? I thought nobody was going to show up. And literally, as I was coming here, I had about 30 friends send me emergencies. I can't come. I broke down. This happened. And I was like, oh my God, nobody's going to be there. It's going to be John and me sitting up there talking to each other, which is fine. I think he's a wonderful guy. But so I'm completely moved by you. And I'm also just want to say, I know a lot of you have been very supportive for a very long time. Thank you for that. Thank you to the press club. Thank you. And KPFK, please join.
And can we please have one more happy birthday and one more big round of applause